In this video, our goal is to look at the basic types of errors that we might come across when we're coding in Visual Basic. Okay, the first big classification of errors would basically just be syntax errors. In other words, you've typed something in incorrectly or typed in something to tell the program what to do that's basically illegal to do. One real simple example of this would just be I've got this text box here that is its text proper is being put into this variable over here, right? If I mistype the name of that text box, it comes up with this squiggly line underneath here and a little exclamation point saying, hey, there's a problem with this. If I click on that exclamation point, it's giving me this error message that txt_length is not a member of this review rectangle area form. So basically what it's saying is this object isn't on this form. You've got a problem here. And so typically just seeing that might prompt me to know, oh, I missed my G when I was typing it in there. And if I put that in there, then I'm just fine. That type of thing doesn't happen that often if you're using your IntelliSense drop-downs and choosing things from there, but it still can happen. Okay, syntax errors are usually pretty easy to find because, like I said, Visual Basic tries to do what it can to prompt you to those errors, puts a squiggly line under there. Now, sometimes you don't understand what Visual Basic's trying to tell you the problem is, but at the same time, at least you can see that those errors are there. Much more difficult errors to recognize would be a logic error. Okay, and of course, the classic logic error would just be, maybe in my formula here, I just type in something incorrectly in my formula. So maybe instead of having a times sign, I accidentally put a plus sign, which of course is not going to calculate area. And it's not going to calculate perimeter either for those of you that maybe made a mistake with your perimeter formula last week. And when I type it in that way, the program doesn't care. It thinks that's what I want to do. And so I have a logic problem there that's not going to display the answer that I want, right? Those can be kind of difficult to recognize sometimes. And that's where I think if you're commenting some of these things, that helps, because even you're typing in this comments area is what I'm calculating here. That might prompt your brain to recognize, hey, this formula isn't for area. I have to have the time symbol in there. So I think sometimes commenting helps you catch stuff like that. Of course, something that might be even tougher to catch here would be, let's say that these were accidentally put in here as integers, right, for the length and the width. If I wasn't thinking about that and I just accidentally put length and width in here as integers, and of course I got to change the name. This is where putting those prefix names on too is helpful, because here again I'm getting reminded of what these are. They're not exactly the same, and that int there, or the DBL, tells me those are doubles. And that's where I think naming that stuff correctly might help here as well, in that we've got integers going into a double right here. And so when that's happening, we could be prompted that this isn't going to calculate correctly. And I haven't fixed this everywhere in here, so there's still some error messages popping up. But the main thing to note here is if I have decimal numbers that get put into these integer variables, they're going to get rounded up or rounded down when they're calculated here. If someone puts in a double, it's going to convert it to an integer, and then area is not going to calculate correctly, right? So that's another thing to watch here. As a matter of fact, let's just fix all these here, because when you do have a logic error, one tool that you have at your disposal to find these is in your debugging tools. You can do what's called setting a breakpoint, right? So let's say, I think I got all this stuff fixed in here now. Let's say I'm running this And so the person comes along and they're putting in 2.5, 2.5. They're clicking for an answer. And this is, in this instance, it's getting rounded down. So it ends up with 4. But the person's looking at it and going, what's going on here? And we know that the problem is these are being treated as integers. But that's easy for us because we've placed that error in there automatically. If we didn't know, we might have more of a problem here figuring out what's going on. One thing we can do here is we can set breakpoints. You know, when a program goes through all this stuff, it runs really quickly. It's like, what did it really just do? So what we can do is there's this little gray bar over here. It's probably hard to see on my screen. On your screen, it should be a little easier. There's a little gray bar there. If I click there, I can put in what's called a breakpoint right here. When I put in a breakpoint and I run this program, what happens is the program's going to execute its code till it gets to this breakpoint, and then it's going to stop right there. So in this instance of me putting in 2.5 and 2.5, clicking answer, notice here the program just halted itself right here. And the nice thing about that is I can hover my mouse over some of these different variables and see what's going on here. It's like, okay, yeah, I know that area is going to show 4. Why is it doing that? Then I look over here and I see length is 2 and width is 2. And that's when it probably will click in my head of saying, well, I see that the text box text was 2.5. Oh, and when it's going in there, it's becoming 2. So seeing how setting a breakpoint and then looking at the various values of items here can probably help you find this problem of a logic error. So that's one thing I really suggest is setting breakpoints. Sometimes you're going to just have to set a breakpoint in your program and figure out what's going on here with something that you did incorrectly. And then when you want to take the breakpoint out, all you do is click that red dot in there again. It goes away. I would go in here and fix those problems and we're good to go. Okay. Another type of problem, though, that you'll encounter are exceptions or runtime errors. Okay. And that can happen because, you know, maybe you're trying to have something in code, a variable data type convert that just won't convert. Like the classic thing is you're trying to put a string into a number type of variable like an integer or a double. And while Visual Basic won't necessarily prompt you with an error on that in here, it can happen during runtime, and then it's going to stop and throw an exception and say, hey, I can't do this. Another classic example of this is we've got some global variables up there. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to move these assignment statements up there. Because now, we could do this. If these were local, in other words, if I was, and I'm just going to put a comment mark in front of those so I don't have to get rid of them, and it's going to ignore that. If these variables were local, in other words, if they were inside this click event, I could do a declaration statement and my assignment statement all in one. Okay? When they're global, I can't, and if I try to run this now, I am going to get this exception error right here. Invalid operation exception was unhandled. Okay? And you know, reading that the first time, you're going to be like, what is it talking about? And it's basically saying an error occurred creating the form. Okay? That's your clue right here. It was trying to build the form, and it couldn't. And what's basically going on here is if we look at our code, we were taking this text box text and putting in the variable, but all that's happening, it's trying to do that when the form is basically coming into existence, getting written, getting drawn. And it can't do that, okay? So you can't, when these things are global, you can't make that assignment statement and the variable declaration in the same spot. You have to have that happen at different points in time. I can't change the code while it's debugging either. But so that's another thing. That's an error message. That was an exception that got thrown because it was trying to draw the form and we were trying to gather data from the text box at the same time, and it couldn't do that. So we would have to move these assignment statements down here inside of this click event, just like we had them earlier, and then we wouldn't get that exception. So those are some of the basic errors you'll encounter.